Now, here's Michael Smerconish.
Seth Stoughton has written a very provocative piece for Smerconish.com. Elements of it, I think, will be counterintuitive to folks in law enforcement and, I suspect, some gun enthusiasts. He is an associate professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. He's also the author of Evaluating Police Uses of Force. He has a particular interest in the use of deadly force. That's a research concern of his. And it's nice to have you, Seth, on the program. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So as I read what you wrote and reflected on this issue, I was thinking about how in a prior life, I used to frequent a gun range. And there I would see this prototypical classic target. I can picture exactly the target that I have in mind. It's a white guy. He's pointing a gun. He looks to be about 5'9" or so, 5'10", looks to weigh, to my eye, about 190, which is me minus a dime. He's clean shaven, and he is pointing that gun right at me. And what am I supposed to do? Well, if I look closely at that target, I see a circle around his face and I see a circle around his chest. And what I remember being told is you've got to shoot for body mass, which to me has always meant shoot to kill. Or as former Philadelphia Police Commissioner and Mayor Frank L. Rizzo told me personally in a conversation about my then .38, don't pull it unless you intend to use it. And if you use it, you must shoot to kill. This all seems at odds with what's going on in LeGrange, Georgia. What did you find down there, and what are they doing?
Yeah, the LeGrange, Georgia Police Department has implemented a new policy and training that they call Shoot to Incapacitate, that tells officers that in some limited circumstances, and when they are comfortable doing so, instead of shooting to center mass, the upper torso, which has been a core part of police firearms training for generations, they can drop their point of aim to the pelvic girdle, basically the area from the mid-thigh to the belly button. Not in all situations, and they're never required to do so, but it formalizes this option that really hasn't been part of police training ever.
And what's the logic? What's the mindset behind it?
The idea is that if you look across the board at fatal police shootings, about a third of them involve someone who did not have a gun, who had a bladed weapon or other edged weapon or a blunt object or something like that. And in at least some of those situations, the LeGrange Police Department believes officers have the time to establish with good tactics a course of fire where if that person becomes aggressive, they have the luxury of shooting in a way that can still result in death, but is less likely to result in death than shooting at the traditional center mass target.
Right. I wanted to make clear. I mean, you may be shooting with an intent of incapacitating and kill the individual nonetheless. Nothing assures that it won't be a lethal shot. You could miss, you could hit an artery. There are a lot of things that could still happen.
Absolutely. And this is not something other than deadly force. This is not viewed in the LeGrange Police Department as a less lethal force option. Using a firearm is deadly force, period. It's just deadly force that is marginally less likely to be fatal than shooting someone in the traditional center mass target.
Is there a hypothetical that comes to mind, a scenario where this would be the go-to?
So I went down to LeGrange and went through the training and asked a question very like this. What's the best example that you could give me of when this would be applicable? And the example was a suicidal subject, someone who had a knife to their own neck. There's some prolonged negotiation where officers have the time to use the best possible tactics and also have the option to have their firearms out and aimed in anticipation that the situation may turn bad. In
Professor
that
Stoughton,
case, if this...
I was going to say, we had exactly that case in Philadelphia 1 year ago. Walter Wallace, a 27-year-old African-American with a history of mental health issues. The neighbors or the family, I'm not sure which, called the police when they arrive on the scene. It's a man with a knife. gunfire erupts, he's dead. As you're speaking, I'm thinking of exactly that case. Pardon my interruption.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The reality is these situations, while certainly rare, are not unheard of. They're not uncommon. It's not always the immediate attack as an officer gets out of their car where they truly have no other option but to shoot to end that threat. And the best way to do that is center mass. Sometimes, even in high pressure shooting situations, officers have a little more in the way of time. And that's the best situation, as it was explained to me. That's the best situation where officers have the flexibility to potentially drop their point of aim from center mass to the pelvic girdle.
What's the argument against introducing this as an alternative? Because, as you well know, given your investigation, and I know from reading the stories about LeGrange, there's been a lot of blowback from law enforcement quarters who think this is a huge mistake. What do they say?
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of criticism, and I should be honest that I'm not an advocate for it just yet. I'm not sure how I feel about the program because I think some of the criticisms are quite valid. The criticisms break up in a couple of different ways, one of which is, can officers even do that? Are they going to be able to hit a target that is smaller than center mass? Given what we know about police shootings is that officers often miss. In fact, at most ranges, at most distances, except within arm's reach, officers miss more often than they hit. So is it even possible for officers to direct fire to a smaller target in a way that can stop a threat?
It's not only it's not only do they have the skill set necessary, but also the judgment. You know, would any of us have the judgment to immediately make a split-second decision? Oh, wait, this is a case where I'm shooting for pelvic mass and not, the chest.
That's exactly right. The second type of concern here is, are officers going to be able to make good judgment calls in high stress situations? And good judgment calls here means in both directions. Are officers going to make the mistake of shooting to the pelvic girdle when they should not, when they should be shooting center mass? Or are officers going to make the mistake of shooting center mass when they could have shot to the pelvic girdle and potentially open themselves or the agency up to criticism, if not liability, for failing to shoot to the pelvic girdle? I think these are all real concerns. And an additional one that I have is, although this is still supposed to be deadly force, might it actually increase the number of police shootings? That is, a situation where an officer would not shoot center mass, but could lawfully shoot to the pelvic girdle. We might see a decrease in fatal police shootings, but potentially an increase in the total number of police shootings. Unfortunately, a lot of these issues and concerns are empirical, and we don't have a lot of evidence to back up any particular argument just yet. So what I'm looking forward to is seeing how this experiment, and it is something of a bold experiment in LeGrange, plays out and seeing what happens.
Any data in yet? I guess I'm asking in a nice way. Has anyone been shot by law enforcement in LeGrange since they started the program?
They've had one incident that played out exactly as their training would suggest. They had an officer who got out with an individual who charged the officer with a machete. The officer fired center mass. The officer later stated that he had planned out his course of fire in his mind. He was going to shoot to the pelvic girdle and then walk it up. If the shots to the pelvic girdle weren't effective, he could bring the shots up to center mass. But those initial shots to the pelvic girdle were effective, and the individual was immediately stopped and not too long ago got out of the hospital to be charged.
Professor Stoughton, did you gain an impression when you went to LeGrange as to whether the cops themselves want this alternative?
Yeah, that was maybe the most interesting part. Many of the officers that I spoke to admitted to being initially very hesitant because, including the training sergeant who developed the program for them, he initially spent quite a bit of time trying to disprove it, trying to establish that this was a bad idea for them. And ultimately, what they came around to as they were exposed to the ideas and they went through the training for it, is this is an option. And the sense that I got is the officers liked being treated like professionals who could handle themselves in high stress situations and being told, look, you never have to do this, But this is an option that in the right circumstances is something that's available to you. My sense is that the officers I spoke to, at least, were looked at that very favorably.
You made reference to liability concerns. The trial lawyer in me envisions the cases already where someone is killed and the argument becomes, well, you should have shot to wound. You should have shot to incapacitate. Why did you shoot the decedent in the heart when you could have shot in the thigh? Because after all, they were just holding a broken bottle, or whatever the fact pattern might be.
Yeah, I think there are two responses to that. One response is we already hear exactly those arguments. We hear them in the media, in public discourse, and we hear them in the courtroom. So there's nothing particularly new about that argument just because this agency has adopted this particular policy. But the policy response is that this is a permissive policy, not a mandatory policy. The LeGrange Police Department training that I went through is very clear that an officer is never required, and in fact, it's never even suggested that they do this. The officer has to, the same way they would in any situation, justify the use of force decision that they make. And as long as the officer can do that, the agency will back them 100%. That's very consistent with any use of force. Why use a taser instead of just tackling someone? Well, as long as the officer can explain why that was reasonable under the circumstances, the agency should back them on it.
What did the training consist of?
There was several hours of classroom training that went into the theory why LeGrange Police Department was doing this, acknowledging that it was different from what other agencies do and what policing traditionally has done. There was a great deal of evidence presented in the training about why medically this makes sense, not as a way to completely prevent death, but as a way to reduce death, along with why it is an effective way to stop a threat. Again, that's a threat with a melee weapon. It's not going to stop someone with a gun from shooting at you, which is why the training is pretty blunt that this is not an option that's appropriate for someone who is armed with a firearm. After the classroom training, there's both dynamic scenario training, basically an instructor in a protective suit, and the trainee, me in this case, with simunitions, like a paintball gun, but one that is an officer's duty weapon that fires paintballs. So you go through some actual scenarios, or at least some scripted scenarios, where you as the officer going through the training have to make the decision about whether to shoot to the pelvic girdle, whether to shoot to center mass, or whether or not to shoot at all. And then there's a range qualification process, just like the target that you were talking about earlier, except this is a full-size target, so it's head to toe instead of just that head and torso. And officers go through shooting at different ranges and to different targets, including in the pelvic girdle area.
How often did you find yourself shooting to incapacitate instead of shooting for body mass?
The scenario training, in part, because I went through in a somewhat abbreviated fashion, the scenario that I went through was really designed to provide that option. So I could certainly see someone shooting for center mass. It involves someone coming at you with a machete. I elected to shoot to the pelvic girdle initially with rather the same plan that if that was not effective, you could always walk the shots up in what shooters might recognize as a failure drill. So you could decide either way, and I think justify that, which is part of the point of the scenario. I ended up not shooting in one scenario and then shooting to pelvic girdle in another one.
Professor, this is fascinating. Sum up. Professor Seth Stoughton, who's written a great piece for Smerconish.com on what's going on in LaGrange, Georgia. He, an associate professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law and author of the book Evaluating Police Uses of Force. What do you most want people to know about what you witnessed and what you've learned?
I'd like people to realize that it is something to think about. I am not in a position to advocate that any agency should adopt it just yet, but as we are looking forward to the continual evolution of professional policing, I think we need to be open-minded about what our options are. So I would urge anyone in policing or beyond to not reject this out of hand, to engage with it substantively. They can always decide that it's not for them, but let's do that for the right reasons instead of just as a knee-jerk rejection.
Well said. Professor, thank you so much for the insight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.